much to welcome all of the proper hagiographers tonight for the fourth session of the Academia Bessarion. And we're very grateful that Danuta Shanza and Julia Barrow are taking on this task. And at the end, I'm going to ask if it'll be all right also to bring in a woman saint who was in Florence at the time of Dante. And she's a splendid mixture of all of the same miracles as Monagonda, but she's also very much involved in the architecture of Florence and many other projects. So I'm going to turn it over to you, and I'm really grateful that I didn't have to spend all my time preparing tonight. Welcome.
Thank you very much, dear Julia. For anybody who joined late, we have been having a problem with invaders of this session, and I hope we don't. I hope that doesn't continue. I hope we're unter uns now. If I could ask you, maybe for the time being, to keep the quality of the sound as good as possible, turn off your microphone if you're not speaking. That would make sure that there's not a lot of feedback. I think now what we'll do is, begin and hope that everything works out all right, demons and all. I want to introduce us quickly, I'm Danuta Shanza, and I teach Latin philology of late antiquity and the Middle Ages at the University of Vienna, and then my companion, my sister here, is Julia Barrow. You can see her, and you will soon hear her as professor of history at the University of Leeds. As you know, Gregory had some debates about whether one had lives or whether one had a life. And so in line with Gregory's views on the matter, I'm just going to give you a very quick vita that I share with Julia. We met in graduate school at Oxford. We've been in the same choir, at the same tables, at the same address, the same college, university, and we received the same degree in different subjects. We've been friends for more than 40 years. We've both had fellowships to Germany to learn German. We have both worked for the Leeds IMC. We've both edited for Early Medieval Europe, and we both edit for DOML, which is the Dumbarton Oaks Medieval Library. We like talking about medieval texts and are looking forward to discussing this particular pre-circulated one with you. And we're most grateful to Julia Holloway for kindly hosting us and giving some airtime to the early Middle Ages. Our broad topic today is hagiography, which is a division of history, and I thought I would begin with a little bit of history of scholarship about hagiography itself. Hagiography is any kind of writing. It's not a genre, it's really a topic. It's a type of writing about saints, about holy people that can appear in any type of genre. And in any language, in any form, in prose or verse. And there is a concept or two that we need to apply when we start studying a saint, and that is what the saint's hagiographical coordinates are. This term is one that was used by Father Hippolyte de Leué, who was one of the Bollandists. He was living at the 20th century. He lived a long time then. And the key points about the hagiographical coordinates are having a location for the saint, which is the saint's burial place. It's not the saint's place of origin, and also a date. And this is normally not their birthday, but their birthday into eternal life, and the month and day of their deposition, their burial, at the place where they would eventually receive cult. And for our saint, we can read in the Bollandist work that she was buried in the church of Saint-Pierre in Tours, and we hear, for example, later on that her bones were seized by raging Calvinists in 1562. Julia Barrow will tell you a little more about the subsequent history of her body, but what the Bollandists use to write a scientific history of their saints are known as hagiographic dossiers. Each saint has a different dossier. These are all the documents that are used to reconstruct the saints' lives, the saints' deeds, the saints' miracles, the saints' subsequent reception. Most people who are interested in looking at a 6th century woman saint would go to Radegundis, also known as Radegund and Radegund of Sainte-Croix in Poitiers. And she lived from 532 to 587. She's really at the top end of the social scale. She was a Thuringian princess. She was taken captive by the Franks in 532. She was married to Clothar II, circa 540, and she retired circa 546. So she's a married woman who left her marriage. Probably because she was unfertile, but we don't know for sure. In circa 556 to 60, she founded the Nunnery of the Holy Cross in Poitiers, and she died in 587. We're very well supplied with information about her because we have a complete life of hers written by Venantius Fortunatus, and we also have a life written by one of her nuns, Baudonivia, rare hagiographical text written by a woman, and we have quite a lot of information about her in Gregory of Tours' 10 books of histories. So this is usually the first sainted woman that one meets in the 6th century. But we're starting with somebody quite different, with a woman called Monegundis, who is a comparatively minor figure. And we're doing an exemplary reading in the sense of par exemple. In other words, we're just taking her as an example to see what we can do working with a short text and with a dossier that has very limited ancient sources. Her sources may be limited. They're really 2 passages, but she had a very, very famous hagiographer, namely Gregory of Tours. Her hagiographical coordinates are not quite so clear. We really only know approximately when she lived. A terminus postquem is 561, and this is provided by the death of Saint Médard of Soissons, and we know this because she visited his relics on her way to Tours, so she must have been after the date at which he died. Some scholars assume that she died pre-573. I'd like to return to that point later because the argument that she died pre-573 has to do with the fact that Gregory does not mention her in his histories. In other words, that she was not active at a time that he was describing events in Tours. So that is one possibility. Another possibility is a much vaguer window, which would just have her predeceasing Gregory himself in 594. We really don't know for sure. We can talk about that later. Gregory of Tours, there are lots of people here who know him very well. He is no doubt one of the most vivid people, or certainly the most important prose writer of the 6th century. He lived from 538 to 594. He was a Gallic Roman aristocrat. He was extremely well connected. He became Bishop of Tours in 573 till 594. And we know him both as a historian and as a hagiographer. His most famous work is called The 10 Books of Histories, Decem Libri Historiarum, often popularly known but incorrectly as the history of the Franks. We will not be dealing with the histories today. But he also wrote hagiographical works that are known as his Libri Miraculorum, his books of miracles. And these books of miracles divide up into several different categories. The first category are shrine miracles. And by this I mean records of healings that occurred at the church where the saint was buried. So people would be ill, they would go visit the church, they might or might not get healed. If they get healed, somebody would make a record, and this would be added to the credit of the saints. And Gregory collected the miracles of Saint Julian of Brioude in one book. He's a rather quirky saint whom I have written about in other contexts, who with very poor hagiographical coordinates. But he also wrote up his own bishopric. He wrote the miracles of St. Martin from Tours in 4 books. So this is a really huge collection of material, and Martin was, of course, a completely historical figure. So shrine miracles are one category of hagiographical writing he produced, and these are interesting because they are we can see a continuity with the ancient world where the same type of recording of healings was going on, for example, at Epidauros and at other ancient shrines. Though, of course, not preserved the way these are on paper, but sometimes epigraphically. He also put together, assembled two collections that are organized by the status of the holy persons involved. Confessors, there are a lot of people here who can explain this to you better than I can. These are people who were willing to be martyred but failed to be martyred. So that's a kind of second level of holiness. Ascetics were regularly treated as confessors later on. It has a very stricto sensu meaning during periods of persecution. Otherwise, it's a bit vaguer. He also wrote about martyrs, and both books are called the glory of these different categories of holy persons. And they are not full narratives of their lives. They're mostly details of remarkable healings. They sometimes have anecdotes. They're usually, each of these elements is less than a page long most of the time. They're short narrative units that are sometimes collected in meaningful groups and are miscellaneous in nature. The Martyrs is a bit more international. The Glory of the Confessors is more centered on Gallo-centric. We come now to where our text comes from, which is called the De Vita Patrum, the Life of the Fathers, and it comes from Gaul. We're using the Dumbarton Oaks Medieval Library translation and text that was produced by Gisèle Denis, who is with us this evening, which is very exciting. We're really happy that you're here with us and you can see what it looks like. You too can have enormous quantities of Gregory's miracles in a huge fat volume if you go to the Harvard University Press website. I can recommend this. It's a beautiful, beautiful book. So within the collection that Gisèle translated is the Vita Patrum. The Vita Patrum translates into the life of the fathers. One might have expected lives of the fathers, since they're different fathers in this volume. But Gregory made a special point about it. He notes that the fathers have different merits, but that they have one life in Christ that nourished them. So he prefers to go with the singular, though most other works of this sort are called the vitae patrum, or lives of the fathers. I can't help thinking of Tolstoy here. Happy families are all alike. Saints have a common life. Every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. Now, this text, the Vita Patrum, had a very special function. You all know that ascetic spirituality really began in Egypt, or at least in the East, also Palestine, Cappadocia, and moved to the West, basically end of the 4th, beginning of the 5th century, and had to be practiced in somewhat different ways. Since there wasn't a warm desert, there was cold Gaul, and a different climate, different conditions, different landscapes. And there are two works from the later 6th century that both are describing the ascetic spirituality of two different areas. The Vita Patrum is doing this for Gaul, how this spirituality got translated from Egypt to Francia, and it's analogous to the dialogues of Gregory the Great, which was completed was written at the same time, completed slightly later, which describes the ascetics of Italy. So both of these can be seen as projects in translation and projects in a form of nationalism too. When we read hagiographical texts, we have certain hermeneutic problems, namely that they all contain common features. I'll give you a few examples, like, for example, not caring to play with other children. Lots of saints are extra virtuous and keep themselves apart. Lots of saints foresee their own deaths. And these are topoi. These are elements that are characteristic of hagiography, and they can sometimes get reduced to boilerplate, where saints can get really too generic, where there's nothing specific, historical, which makes them all, these kinds of texts, look very, very unreliable. So one of the things hagiographers have to do when they're reading that sort of text is look for what's distinctive, and also look for historical information that may not otherwise be known. It's nice to have names, dates, and places. And what is often going on in hagiographical writing is a winnowing to separate the wheat from the chaff. And what we're hoping to do is to give a selective tour of this short text, spending time, excuse me, let me just shut this down here. Sorry, I got backed up there. These are his Libri Miraculorum, and there's the cover. What we would like to do is concentrate on a few passages where there are problems of interpretation or matters of special interest. Let's make that go away. We can put that away, right. So one problem we always have is, does the use of a topos mean that we shouldn't believe what we read, or that it isn't historical? The answer is clearly no. It's better to look at topoi as an available vocabulary for the hagiographer. They want to say that their saint was studious. Their saint may well have been studious, so they say he didn't play with other kids. You can also look at it as and see topoi as etiquette for the holy person. In other words, that it is quite possible that somebody who was being a holy person, just as they were engaged in imitation of Christ, would know of the various topoi that should be used on the appropriate situations. One particular example I would give there is nolo episcopari. Oh, I don't want to be bishop, which shows up constantly in lives of people who are about to be ad-elected as bishops. There's rarely, I believe, a willing or eager bishop, though Julia will correct me. So what one has to do is search and filter for what is marked versus what is unmarked. So let's begin with Vita Patrum. This is introducing us to the ascetics of Gaul. There are 19 fathers in there, but only one mother. And if we do a prosopographical analysis of the Vita Patrum, what we find is that these saints are saints that are related to Gregory's own family and ones that are associated with Clermont or Tours, plus a few exotics. Abraham actually came from the Euphrates, Quintianus from Africa, Zenoch was a Typhal, Portianus, the slave of a barbarian. But what really stands out here is there's only one woman. And so one question one asks is, why this woman? And the obvious answer is that she was right in Gregory's backyard. You have looked at the Vita Patrum. There's one other place where he mentions her. She makes it into his confessors, and here you see she died at Tours, and she'd come from the territory of Chartres, about 150 kilometers northwards, 30 hours on foot. And here we have essentially a summary of the text that we read, but he added something on. Although I've recorded many of those people in the book that I wrote about the life of Monegundus, I am unable to be silent about what happened next. A maidservant of Probatus, my archdeacon, was severely struck by quartan fever, etc., etc. So we can see Gregory at work on his hagiographical project. He had written her up, he thought he had put an end to it, and then there was another miracle, which he felt bound to include. And it's a miracle that has a name associated with it. His archdeacon's maid got healed, and he puts it into the confessors. He was working in amplifying his collections continuously. It's very hard to speak of them and really being finished at any given point. You all know the famous parable of the sower. This is Matthew 13:8, describing what happens to various type of seed in different conditions. And 13:8 is a kind of culmination of the passage where we hear about seed that fell into good ground and brought forth fruit. Some 100-fold, some 60-fold, some 30-fold. I'm telling you about this because it's a very useful parable for understanding the evaluation of different types of lifestyles in late antiquity. Jesus himself said, "Who has ears to hear, let him hear." And of course, the parable at one level is obviously about listening to the word of God, to what extent one could take in the word of God. But it also was interpreted rather more specifically. For example, that the lifestyle, if you were martyred, you had 100-fold fruit. If you were virgin, it was 60-fold. And then specifically with relationship to women, we see in the later 4th century and onwards an equivalent of the 100-fold with virginity. 60 times with chaste widowhood, and 30 times with a respectable marriage. So this is kind of the area where we're talking about female virtue. So it's directly relevant to Monegundis. She is in part a respectable wife. So she would be at that 30%. But there is more to her. And I wanted to introduce, I can't show you many beautiful pictures the way Julia Holloway normally does, but I can show you at least one inscription. We note right at the beginning of her life that she is a bereaved mother. That's really what sets her career as a saint going. And here I can show you a Gallic inscription from Lyon, which talks about a father, Vitalinus, and a mother called Martina, who wrote the text on this stone. Not a great glory, but a pain. It's bad Latin, dolorem instead of dolorem, relating to their children. And what they say is that they buried 3 children, ages ranging from 3 to 7 within 27 days. And one could perhaps guess that this might have been what happened.
Hey, I just wanted to say fuck Mexicans. I don't like Mexicans.
That this could have happened during an epidemic. I mean, we don't know for sure.
You fuck Mexicans, hey. Hey, yo,
Lorenzo, I think time for the axe. Here we can see something even more interesting. So we do have inscriptions that talk about child mortality. Here we can compare Gregory's histories where he's talking about such an epidemic. This one can be dated to 580. The epidemic began in the month of August. It attacked young children, first of all, and to them it was fateful. And so we lost our little ones who were so dear to us and sweet, whom we cherished in our bosoms and dandled in our arms, whom we had fed and nurtured with such loving care. As I write, I wipe away my tears and I repeat once more the words of Job the Blessed, the Lord gave, the Lord hath taken away. As it hath pleased the Lord, so it has come to pass. Blessed be the name of the Lord, world without end, in Thorpe's translation. And what you will notice is that Gregory here is quoting exactly the passage from the book of Job that he also quoted in Monegundis. So I think here, by comparing these two passages, we can have some insight into how Gregory might have talked to bereaved parents. I think we can hear that discourse of consolation also in the phrases here about the little ones, their sweetness, and how terrible it was to lose them to an epidemic. This was a rare case which led Gregory to be sympathetic to Queen Fredegund, whom he did not particularly like at all. So we have to think of the beginning of Monegundis's career as a saint as one that happened after she lost her children. We don't know what age they were, but was certainly much worse child mortality than in the modern period. You will also have noticed as soon as Gregory starts discussing Monegundis, he describes her as belonging to the lesser sex, the weaker sex. And this is, of course, standard. You can't do anything else after the opening of Genesis, of course. But even though men are better, women can be used to show men up. And this is something that is frequently going on in hagiography that compares men or women can also be shown to have their own excellence, their own arete. And these words that Gregory uses are telling. He talks about how women too can triumph. They're not acting lazily, but like men, agonizantem, in combat, fighting. He talks about striving and fighting and sweating and working hard. So he's adopted a whole bunch of metaphors that have to do with male excellence in the battlefield and in games and things like that, and applied them to his female heroine. Women could indeed excel as martyrs, and also, of course, as ascetics. They tend to be split up into Marys and Marthas. You find this theme pretty prominently in Merovingian hagiography. And one of the things that has always amused me is the housekeeping and bathroom cleaning skills of even a princess such as Radegund, as described by her male hagiographer. If you were interested in reading more translations of these sorts of texts, I can recommend to you Joanne McNamara's Sainted Women of the Dark Ages, 1992. And in that, she has an awful lot of vitae of Merovingian women saints, including Monegundis. What you will find if you look at these lives is that a lot of these women were of high social status. So social status can override the weakness of one's sex. And Julia, I hope, will hazard some guesses about Monegundis' status for us soon. This passage is interesting. We hear how the blessed Monegund, like the prudent queen, who came to listen to Solomon's wisdom, left behind her native soil to seek the basilica of the blessed Martin. And we'd seen before how he just said she came from Chartres and she moved to Tours. But here he is using an allusion to the Old Testament and is exploiting the theory about how the Old Testament foreshadows future events and people. The specific story in this case is that of the Queen of Sheba, who famously left wherever she came from. Maybe it was Yemen. She was a wise queen, and she had heard of Solomon's fame, and she was so impressed by his riches, but she was definitely looking up to him. And she was so overwhelmed by what she saw, there was no more spirit in her. And she said to the king, "It was a true report that I heard in mine own land of thy acts and of thy wisdom. Howbeit, I believed not the words until I came, and mine eyes had seen it. And behold, the half was not told me. Thy wisdom and prosperity exceedeth the fame which I heard." Now, the Queen of Sheba is often used in patristic authors as a prefiguration of the church itself, or sometimes of the church that was called from the Gentiles or heathen. But here, she's being used for Monegundis because she is a holy person. But of course, she's nowhere near as holy as we will hear at various points in the story as Martin. So Martin's basilica is taking on the role of Solomon. I couldn't resist showing you this. This is Edward John Poynter. It's the Queen of Sheba approaching Solomon. Here you could see a very different interpretation of the story from the Bible. It's exotic, it's orientalistic, it's perfervid, it's probably slightly X-rated, but none of this is going on in Gregory of Tours. It's really about two dignitaries, the subjugation of the woman to the male one, but the high value of both cases. We now come to the form of accommodation that Monagundis resorted to once she got to tour. So I'm going to turn over to Julia now to talk about the small cell and the tiny window.
Right. Well, I noticed that Gregory stresses sort of smallness with this place, and he does it twice. He applies the term parvula cellula not only to her cell in Chartres, but also to the cell that she moves into at Tours. So he wants you to sort of box Monagundis into a small space, I think. Agreeing, or even actually voluntarily seeking to live in a small enclosed space is quite a common, it's a common form of ascetic discipline, and the final Vita in the Vita Patrum is another cell dweller, though he's got a bit more space to move around in than Monagund has, because he's sort of busy trying to dig out a bit more space, I think. It was women weren't expected to become hermits with as much freedom as men could. They were expected to live in a more whereas male hermits could either live in a boxed-in space or have a bit more freedom. Women preferably were in a sort of boxed-in space, partly so that they wouldn't be at risk of being raped, I suppose. And it was a possible way of displaying holiness within a family setting, because you could sort of set yourself up on your own premises, which is how Monagund begins. But it was easier to manage if you were attached to a major church, which might actually have been one of the reasons why Monagund went to Tours. But ideally, you were seeking a small space to get away from it all, try and be undisturbed, pray a lot. It did mean that you needed a support system. It wasn't something you could attempt if you were poor. And we do notice that Monagund, when she starts off at home at Chartres, has a maidservant to look after her until the girl runs away. But although Monagund did actually try to make up for this by making bread out of snow, I mean, I think the absence of the maidservant must have been a bit tricky, and she must have tried harder at Tours to get a better support network. And being attached to the Basilica of St. Martin would have helped, because she'd probably have been able to tap into a system for providing food. Okay. Lorenzo, I think there may be another person you need to remove from the list of viewers.
Okay, I haven't heard anything yet.
No, but I think I can see something that maybe isn't sort of
kosher.
Kosher, yeah.
Right. Shall I pick up now, or?
Yeah, you pick up.
Right. Okay. we have male recluses too in this collection. One of them is called Kaluppa, and it describes how he sticks his hand out of his cell, and Lupicinus is one. So this is not an exclusively a female form of asceticism. There are men too. It's going to continue to be popular. I thought we would take a quick look at the question of feeding herself. Julia has talked about the helper. Recluses, anchoresses regularly do have helpers. I think what is intriguing is how she looks to the Bible. She looks to the feeding in the desert. Even though she's not in a desert, she sees herself as being in one, and is waiting for manna and needs water. And what happens is that something indeed white descends from heaven. It turns out to be snow. You wouldn't have snow in Egypt, but you do have snow in Gaul. And we read about how she is squeezing the water from the snow and makes her usual bread, or bread as usual. The Latin could be either. And one of the questions here that is intriguing to me, I haven't really researched this completely, is whether this is meant to be a miracle. In other words, that we have a bread being produced out of snow by squeezing snow, or whether there was in fact some flour present. If you look earlier in the passage, it looks as if there isn't any flour. So sometimes Gregory is a messy narrator. I'm not quite sure about that, but it's the kind of question that one asks oneself as one tries to write a commentary on a tricky text like this. We now come to one of the earliest miracles, and we hear that around the cell she had a small garden where she used to go for refreshment. And once she'd entered it and she was walking around, and there was a woman filled with worldly thoughts who had been placing grain to dry on the roof of her nearby house, who observed her indiscreetly from her lookout point. What happens? The woman is blinded, and recognizing her transgression, she went to the blessed Monaghan, that's a typo, and told her what she had done. And the Blessed Lady prostrated herself in prayer and said, "Woe to me that on account of my sinful, wretched person, others' eyes are closed." And she then heals the woman. Now, I have found this passage slightly puzzling, so here I'm going to make an argument to you about what I think it's actually about. If you look at the phrase, I think that Edward James translated it as going for exercise, and Giselle has for refreshment. The phrase in Latin is pro quadam relevatione. And relevatione means lightening of weight, relief from weight. And I looked at the quadam for a certain lightening of weight, as it were, or relief, and decided that it was almost certainly a euphemism for relieving herself. And I will try to show you a few parallels for this situation. I asked myself how this is described when we talk about female saints. We know a little bit about it. For example, in Fortunatus's Life of Radegund 5, Radegund would leave her husband's bed. As an excuse, she would say she needed to go pro humana necessitate. She needed to rise from her bed for a human necessity. In other words, to go to the privy, and there she would pray at night, separate from her husband. Here, I think we can look at some parallels that might support my interpretation. Some of you probably know the plays of Hrotswita, of Gandersheim, one of which is called the Thais, and that is about the reform of a prostitute who then becomes an anchoress, in fact, a recluse in the desert. And this passage comes from the point at which Thais realizes that she's going to be inside a very small cell. And she says, whatever your paternal solicitude orders, my vileness will not refuse to submit to. In other words, I'll do anything you like, but there is a particular inconvenience in this dwelling, which it will be difficult for my fragile nature to endure. So there's something she doesn't like about being confined in a cell. She's embarrassed to talk about it. And then finally she says, what could be more unpleasant than that in one and the same place I will be obligated to perform a variety of bodily necessities? And Paphnutius is stern, ineluctable, tells her to deal with it. It's appropriate that you wash away the sweetness of this wickedly soothing pleasure through the discomfort of excessive stench. So she will have to live with her own body and her own excrement, in effect. So we can see that people were thinking about this problem of, what you do for a privy if you are a recluse or anchoress. And so I submit that what she saw was the saint using an outdoor privy. It is interesting to see that there is a whole discussion in ancient literature about what one may or may not do in a privy. I guess modern people read in them. If you go to Augustine's De Ordine, you'll see a description of how his young student, Lactantius, was admonished by his mother, Monica, for singing a psalm in a privy that she felt was unacceptable. Privies are also well known to be areas of danger, and we know that that Gregory of Tours was well acquainted with this concept. Arius, the heretic, died in a privy, and in the Vita Patrum 1703, Bishop Nicetius answers a call of nature, and the phrase is ventris purgandi gratia, and he meets a terrifying black demonic apparition in the loo. Martha Baylis has written a book about this phenomenon called Sin and Filth in Medieval Culture, the Devil in the Latrine, that I can recommend to you. So I think we could do a little bit of cultural history here. And one of the issues may also have been that the woman saw something she shouldn't have seen, exactly the way Actaeon shouldn't have seen the naked Diana, or somebody like Baubo shouldn't have exposed herself. She saw the nudity of the saint, and I would guess that was why she was punished with blindness. But I can't tell you for sure. It's just a thought that occurred to me while I was looking at this text. We're now at the point where she's receiving credit. She was glorified among her relatives through these signs of holy power, and because she wished to avoid falling into the trap of vainglory, she devoutly went to the holy Bishop Martin's Basilica, leaving behind her husband and family and her whole household. I mean, this is obviously not ideal wife behavior, but it is behavior that Jesus might have felt was okay. Let the dead bury their dead. Leave the family. What is interesting here is the sign that she was already fighting with one of the monastic evil thoughts, namely vanity or vainglory, because she was getting attention as a healer at the time when she was still living in her own kind of family house in her cell. And so somehow her decision was to cure her vainglory by going to visit Martin, by seeing somebody who is greater than her, is how I would take that. On her way to Tours, she passes through a town called Èvres, and there she worships the relics of Medardus of Soissons, and this passage is important for the dating. In other words, it must be after 561. So it's nice to have at least one firm dating anchor for all of this. Otherwise, we really wouldn't know very much at all. When she gets to Tours, she arrived at the Basilica of the Holy Martin, and there she prostrated herself before his tomb and gave thanks that she had deserved to see his holy grave with her own eyes. So we can see again that the gratefulness of the suppliant, the Queen of Sheba, who's impressed by her encounter with the even greater king in Israel. And we hear about her small cell. There are no specifics. Nothing is. We aren't told anything about where this place actually is. And I'm going to turn over to you now, Julia. This is the map. I had to go to Google Maps. Sorry, it looks a bit dorky.
Well, it's still very useful. I think if the map stretched a bit further northwards, you'd see the River Loire running.
Right, yeah.
And the church where she eventually got buried, which is Saint-Le-Puelier, and you'll notice the nuns bit in Puelier. Though quite early on in the Middle Ages, it actually became a community of clergy. I think it wasn't a nunnery for that long. It's not far from the modern-day Basilica of St. Martin of Tours, but of course that's a 19th century replacement for the absolutely enormous medieval Basilica of St. Martin of Tours, which included, if you see the bit that says Tour Charlemagne temporarily closed and the Tour de l'Horloge on the map, those are actually bits of the basilica that survive. They didn't pull down everything. And you can see simply from where they are on the map that it's a pretty big span. Of course, it wasn't just the church building. The church building was huge. There was a big precinct around it. There were several smaller churches around it. And it wasn't even the cathedral for Tours, which was some way to the east. I think if you pursue the Rue de la Monnaie and stretch somewhat further to the east, you probably run into the ancient citadel bit of Tours with the cathedral in it. But the Basilica of St. Martin is a rival to the cathedral and and very, very rich and very successful. And it was a real magnet for pious women in the early Middle Ages. Monaghan was not the only pious, reasonably well-off woman who went to Tours. Clotilde, the widow of Clovis, spent many years of her widowhood at Tours, and Ingeborg, who was the mother of the Bertha who married Ethelbert of Kent, had, I'm not sure if she actually retired to St. Martin's, but she certainly gave it money. And she got advised by Gregory of Tours, so she clearly had strong Tours connections. So in some ways, I suspect Tours might have been a bit like Harrogate or Cheltenham in the 19th century, a real sort of place for wealthy women who wanted to live very respectably, possibly also quite piously, and quite comfortably, probably. Monaghan wasn't so big on the comfort, but I'm sure she was big on the respectability.
Thank you, Julia. I'm sorry that I didn't get the right bits of the map.
No, it's quite tricky to. There are archaeological maps of Tours which sort of plot the development of the basilica, but you would need an archaeologist to explain the various phases, and of course, the revolution just got rid of it all, so pretty much.
Right. Well, when I was there, the previous December, Maurus was there too. We actually got to see the remains of Perpetuus's basilica. The nuns have control over it, and you can go down into the basement below the modern basilica and see remains in the lapidarium, things like that. And this is for you too, Julia. This is Pierre Le Poilier, where her cell would have been. This is what it looks like now. And there's a beautiful garden there. Actually, I realized that I was spending time in it, even though it was December and rather cold. So we can't see exactly what it would have looked like then. It's been, we have medieval tour on top of it, but we at least have a little bit of an idea of the scene. I wanted to say a few things about Monagundis's healing techniques, and there's one passage where there's a boil or a pustule that bursts into 4 parts like the cross. She makes the sign of the cross, and the thing kind of sympathetically responds and bursts open. It's kind of sci-fi, but very, very pious. And she seems to have a bit of a specialty in pustules. Her work is very, very hands-on. We have descriptions of where she is stroking and straightening people's hands. She's touching them. There's another pericope where she is palpating the abdomen of a sick boy. She lays hands on eyes. We hear the description of cataracts that are parting once she touches somebody's eyes, and all of this looks rather medical, which is, I think, an interesting thing to observe, because hagiographers have a choice when they're describing miracles. Sometimes the miracles just occur really by remote control, or with a sign alone, not with any contact. Sometimes a relic is used, sometimes an object, and we'll see that other sorts of things are used too, particularly spittle, and that would have been on the basis of the model in the New Testament, where Jesus uses spittle for healing. But I think that if we compared her healings to those of the male saints, they look pretty medical. Julia, this one is for you. This is the husband's intervention. While these things were happening, her husband heard of the Blessed Lady's reputation.
Yes, well, I'm not quite sure precisely what's going on here, but presumably either her husband wanted to get her back to Chartres so that he would be able to benefit from her fame as a miracle worker and obviously skilled healer, or possibly people in Chartres were sort of nudging him and saying, "What are you doing, allowing your wife to run away like that?" I'm not quite sure. I suspect possibly more the former, but it might have been the latter.
It is hard to tell. So, and the other question is, how is the hagiographer spinning or using whatever the story is? This begins to look, it is presenting itself as a story about her reputation as a holy woman, a healer, and that's all fine. And that would look as if there was cultic competition, that they wanted her back in Chartres rather than having her in Tours. It's not completely clear, but it's a passage one has to take into account. But then when we go to the next passage, we hear she went there and she begged St. Martin's help so that she could return. We don't really know how it happened, so that he who had given her the desire to arrive at his basilica would help her to achieve it. And she managed to get back, and she returned to her own cell, and she was no longer sought by her husband. I should mention in this context that there are definitely situations for married women and also for women who were meant to get married but didn't get married, where their husbands or their fiancés try to gain them back because they are attached to them. So we may have kind of warring accounts here. No longer sought by her husband sounds an awful lot like the other type of situation where it's, I want my wife back. And I can show you a nice example of that later on. We've talked about infant mortality in this period. Another topic that is worth saying something about is birth defects, because we have a passage where this is specifically referred to. People have all sorts of explanations about why children are born with are born handicapped or ill or something. And one of the explanations you see quite frequently in this period is that the children were the children of people who had sex on a day they shouldn't have had sex, or they worked on Sunday, or they did something bad like that. And in this case, we hear an explanation that the mother was a prostitute, and the word used is a pota, which is a representation of the word puta, which would be pute in modern French, and he actually apologizes for using that folksy word, but Monagundus doesn't care about any of this and heals in that case with spittle or saliva. So these punitive miracles that affect the second generation are pretty common. They're part of the kind of mindset. I wanted to mention the boy with snakes in his belly because, I think we don't believe in boys with snakes in his belly, but Gregory is constantly using words that really are words for snake, like serpentes and angues, and he makes an allusion to Matthew 12:34 by talking about the germen pestiferae generationis, the generation of, pest-bearing creatures. What the kid probably had was some form of worm, but worm is, of course, less theologically exciting or less theologically resonant. So that might be a nice example of how a medical writer who was describing such a scene would describe it differently, or particularly a pagan medical writer might describe it differently from the way Gregory is describing it. There's a nice passage where we can see a blind woman who comes to Monagundis to be healed in Vita Patrum 1936. And there she defers to Martin, the higher authority for healing the blind woman. And she says, "Quid vobis mihi? What business do you have with me, men of God?" And she's being humble, said, "Go to the boss instead. He's the expert." Here, there's a type of typology being used. She's being compared to the pericope of the marriage of at Cana, where Jesus is depicted as saying to his mother, "Quid mihi et tibi est, mulier?" What business have I with you, woman? And in that passage, he says, "My hour is not yet come." He does actually perform the miracle. But in the situation with Monagundis, in fact, her hour has come. She actually does perform that miracle. So we can see here a kind of male typology that is used for the female saint. And what we've got here is a kind of intertextuality with the Bible that lines her up with Jesus before his first miracle. This is the end of the Vita Monagundis, and we see that a community has grown up around her. They're actually calling them nuns by this point, and they're worried about the continuity of their community after their mother dies. And she, of course, again defers to Martin. "You will have the Holy Bishop Martin as your great shepherd," and she also promises that she will be available somehow in their dear company. We'll soon see how she maintains her presence. So obviously the community has been in some way taking care of her, living off her work, living with her. But what is going to happen to the continuity of the cult at the, or the continuity of the community, let's call it community to be safer at this point, when Monagund dies? And what they ask for are kind of like contact relics. They want her to bless oil and salt so that they can continue to satisfy the people who will come for healing miracles. And Julia, do you want to say anything about economics?
Sorry, I was having problems getting my thing unmuted. I was clicking on it and it wouldn't work. Right. Well, her little community probably could live partly off charity, but it's obviously going to make a better go of things if it can pay its way some of the time at least. And what they specialise in, obviously, is healing. That's what Monagund has been particularly good at. And presumably she has trained the nuns who have joined her to do the same. They want to carry on doing this, but they know that it won't work unless you've got the sort of special patent brand that is going to work the miracles. So they want oil and salt that she has touched herself.
Right, and later on in a lot of these Merovingian lives, you hear different solutions like exudations from the tomb, or oil that is in touch with exudations from the tomb. But once you have a saint who is no longer living, there are different methods for the saint to exercise their miraculous healings.
That oil and salt are potentially holy. I mean, salt particularly, but oil too, because of being capable of used for lighting.
Right. We then we've had the saint's career is divided into the part while they're still alive, and then, of course, they may have an even more glorious posthumous career. And so at that point in the text, we move on to the posthumous miracles. And what we can note about them, there's a postulous foot. Some of the people are named. So I think we're seeing here the remains of a liber miraculorum that would have noted people's names. These are healing miracles primarily. Demonic possession is mentioned, but not in any detail. We have fever, we have the boy Leodinos, we have a paralytic, we have fever, we have 2 mutes. These 2 things are interesting, and that is that there's a blind man who comes to the tomb and he falls asleep. Perhaps there was some sort of vestigial incubation, sleeping in the shrine of the healing saint going on. It's very vestigially possible in some of these texts. It's really not standard the way it is, say, in shrines in Egypt, even as late as the 7th century, or in Byzantium. But what we have here is a dream epiphany, that she actually appears to the blind man. And it's kind of fun because, of course, the blind man can't see her in a waking vision because he's blind. So she appears in his dreams. And the blind man has got 2 eyes, and there's a rather amusing example of sharing the credit with Martin, because she says, I will take care of one of your eyes, but you have to go for the healing of the second eye to Martin. So there's this co-sponsorship, this sense that she's somehow not quite enough on her own without Martin too. And I would submit that we're hearing Gregory's hierarchies there. Now comes the problem of reading between the hagiographical lines. So I'm going to just put out a few thoughts out there. We've got a female recluse who has some of the characteristics of a medicine woman or a physical healer. Maybe she was trained early in her life. This is the kind of thing that, Aline Roussel talks about in Croire et Guérir. So I think we need to look at her as a kind of proto-doctor maybe too. When we go to Gregory, we can see that he really spent quite a lot of time in the Vita Patrum, writing her up, but as a subordinate to Martin. It's always with reference to Martin. And he returned to her then with an update, but it was an update that concerned his archdeacons as somebody important to him. So he's collecting the miracles and improving the record, of course, of the Basilica of Martin. I would need to look in more detail, actually get an Excel sheet, but I think there is some gendering in the presentation of the miracles. I had a quick look through the Vita Patrum, and you don't find men so constantly praying to have the grace to work a miracle. A lot more of them are able just to have it happen or just do it. And she is characterized by her extreme humbleness, always begging, always, may I be granted this, try Martin first, me second. I think that's might be a gendered feature there. I'm not sure. We're continuing the question of between the lines. Comes the question of whether he knew her personally. And he doesn't mention any acquaintance, and he's not present in the narrative of Vita Patrum 19. And we know that he could have been, because if we look throughout the rest of the Vita Patrum, we could constantly see him explaining his contact with various people. how he brought this person's relics here, he met that person, his relative told him about that person, he spoke to the other person. We definitely know which of these people he met. So there's a kind of silence about this that is a little odd. I think that one of the questions we could ask ourselves whether there's competition between Chartres and Tours for Holy Woman and her cult, and that could be what's behind the husband's reclaiming his wife. But an alternative idea would be that this is a topos that protects the married saint who leaves her husband by having her husband regret the separation. And we have a nice example of that in the life of Radegund that talks about the great King Clothar, and he wants to get his queen back, ut suam reginam acciperet. And if there are other examples of this, I don't have them at hand, but you definitely do not want to be a good riddance type of married female saint. That's not standard. I was interested in two other lives, which I don't really have time to discuss in the Vita Patrum, and these are both examples of ascetics who hitch themselves on at Tours. They're kind of parasitical, and maybe the question is also whether they're in competition. Senok established himself in a kind of ruined wall of Tours, and Gregory tells us that this was during the time of his predecessor Euphronius. And then when Gregory arrived, the recluse Senok actually left his cell to meet him, and this would have been in 573. And then he gets uppity, he gets vainglorious, and he's rebuked by Gregory. So we can see a kind of not entirely friendly exchange between Gregory and these kind of local individual competition ascetics. We also have Leobardus, who came to Tours, and Gregory gives him some improving advice. And he too he's a male who at least once has to pray for the grace to heal. So what I am wondering, people, if you go to the Christian prosopography of Gaul, you'll see that the scholars there assume that Monegundus must have been dead before Gregory became bishop in 573, and this is here a kind of argument ex silentio. I'm not so sure about that. I'm wondering whether there might have been he might have known her, there might have been a more fraught relationship, and that he's including her because he feels compelled to, but that there is a bit of a silent treatment going on. I really don't know for sure, but I put that idea out there. And Julia, I'm going to turn over to you now for what happened later after we leave Monegundus at the time Gregory died, which would have been 594.
Well, she carries on being one of the minor Tours cults. There were others, like St. Brice, for example, other sort of satellite saints surrounding Martin at Tours. I think possibly the sort of most exciting bit is in the late 9th century when a count somewhere in modern, what is now Belgium, in Hainaut, goes to Tours and begs to have some of Monegundus's relics and takes them back to his homeland and sets up a church in Chimay with the relics, and is pursued by a priest who wants to venerate the relics and who, I suppose, gets put in charge of the church, which becomes a collegiate church of clerics. And later Benedictine Abbey. That's Chimay in modern Belgium. It's probably the most, I think it was probably the most significant church in the Middle Ages dedicated to Monaghan, but I'd need to check. That's later in the 16th century. Monaghan's relics in Tours, the ones that hadn't trotted off to Belgium, got disturbed by the Huguenots in the 1560s. And quite a lot of damage was done to shrines in Tours at the time. I think things probably quietened down in the 1570s after the Massacre of St. Bartholomew's Day. Yeah, even minor saints could attract a bit of unwelcome attention.
Right. If you were interested in this and can read Latin, there are very sensational accounts in the Acta Sanctorum that are not complimentary about the violent Calvinists and what they did. Julia Holloway, I'm going to stop my share and I'm now going to pull your PowerPoint up. Is that okay?
Yes, there's so many parallels between my saint, Saint Umiltà in Florence, the time of Dante, and your saint. They are cut off the same cloth. And is the PowerPoint showing up now?
It will in a second. I need to share the screen. So let me.
What is interesting about Saint Umiltà? We can go to the next one.
Okay, I want to go. Let's play.
Yes.
Is that okay?
Right, the next one?
Yeah.
And then the next one.
Right, okay, there you are.
Yes. This is Pietro Lorenzetti, who had painted these very shortly after Umiltà's death. The nun beside her is the one who writes her hagiography. And the miracles are very much shown graphically in the architectural style of the period. Saint Umiltà, she's from Faenza, and like Monagunda from Chartres, she then comes to Florence. So you get the sense of the tale of two cities. And her story is very interesting. Can we go on to the next one?
Yeah.
Yes. Very similar. She's married, her children have died, and she asks her husband for a vow of poverty, which he resists. In medieval canon law, the marriage vow was more important. It had priority over the monastic vows, because Paul had said both husband and wife needed to pay to each other the marriage debt. There was, in Christian marriage, equality, which we tend to forget. It certainly wasn't there in the aristocratic mode of Francesca and Paul, etc. But in the Christian teaching, it was, and you could not enter a convent unless you got your husband's permission to do so. And we've seen also that Monagunda's husband was reluctant about this. She does manage to persuade him when he eventually becomes ill, and he goes off, next slide, into a monastery. And there she is as a nun, and she always wears the sheepskin her head. This will probably be a real detail against rheumatism and so forth, neuralgia. And what is interesting, the convent she enters is the convent of St. Perpetua, who was the saint in Africa, whose servant Felicity is the very first martyr. And its stories, these Egyptian stories, were continued as we saw in Gregory of Tours and as we see in the 13th and 14th centuries. And if we go on to the next one, she is illiterate, and the nuns play a joke on her. They make her go up into the little balcony to read, which she cannot, in the refectory. And this has still been going on when I go to lunch with the monks up at San Miniato. We eat in silence while one of the lectors is reading from the Vitae Patrum. This is the way in which you get layers upon layers, as if you collapse time. And at any rate, St. Umilta proceeds to read, which she is not reading, but words which are inspired. And they are splendid mystic theology. And this will get written into the hagiography about her. Let's go on to the next one. I love the architectural details with even the bell up in this. She then, after 4 years, which is rather like my own story, she fled from her convent and she left her breviary behind. And this is a rather interesting detail because she's going to end up with the breviary later on. And she goes off to live near a monastery of St. Martin. So we see all of these reverberations going on. She walks across the stream without getting her feet wet. And this often is a detail in these saints' legends, including Santa Francesca Romana in the Renaissance, and so on. Okay, the next slide. And a Valombrosan monk has a gangrenous leg, and the doctor says, oh, no way, he's gone. And so the monk asks to be brought to Santa Umilta, and that's the next slide. And there he is. She comes out again with the breviary, with the beautiful red kermes binding, and she heals him. So at this point, the Valombrosan monks had decided they didn't want any women. They were hermits and desiring to be celibate and not have women around at all. But they are won over by this. Here she is in her anchor hold in Faenza. And I love the horse rings, the details from the painting. Now the next one. She decides, after many years, to go to Florence. Florence is at a time of great violence. They had already murdered the Valombrosan abbot Tesaro, that gets into Dante's Inferno. And she decides to go off to be a peacekeeper in this violence, and arriving at the time when Dante is 17 and writing his sonnets and so on. And she comes to the city. She now has a collection of nuns who've gathered around her. And it's St. John the Evangelist who gives this sense in the vision that she should do so. And I love the architectural details. All right, the next one. She proceeds to build her convent with her donkey, bringing the stones and so on. And again, you see these marvelous architectural details, the gold leaf behind. Next slide. And a nurse has been looking after a little boy, and he's fallen and he's dead. They bring the child to Santa Umilta, and she prays over the dead child, and he is brought back to life. At which point the Comune of Florence decides that she is their treasure. And so they send their top architect. This is the time when they're beginning the Duomo and all of the other, the Palazzo del Popolo and so on and so forth. And they build her a convent dedicated to St. John the Evangelist. And unfortunately, Duke Alexander, the Black Prince, the son of a black slave, he will build the Fortezza del Basso and destroy it. Next slide. Here she is with a sick nun, and she tells the others, go and get ice. It's August, and they find this ice beside the wall. Now, Florence had these ghiacciai where they would keep the ice from the winter, and it's from which they were making their gelati and so on and so forth. So this cures this nun's fever. This painting, this panel is actually in Berlin. It's not in the Uffizi. Now the next one. And here she is dictating her splendid mystical theology. Her writings are wonderful, to her nuns who are taking them down in dictation. And now the next one. She is paralyzed from a stroke. But there are all kinds of miracles of food multiplying when there isn't enough, and so on and so forth. And she eventually dies in 1310, the 22nd of May. That's the same date that Frederick Douglass visited the cemetery. And now the next slide. Here she is buried. And they place her in the tomb in her chapel of St. John the Evangelist. And there's this oil that is exuded from the tomb, which cures miracles and so forth. And Bishop Antonio Dorso will then find her body intact. It's now with her nuns in Bagna Ripoli. I've seen it. The panels are separated now from the body, and also there is this wonderful statue by Orcagna, the second, next slide. No, that's the total scene of the Uffizi panels. The next slide. There is her statue. And all of these were once together for the pilgrims, for the funding of her Vallombrosan nuns. And she is the mother foundress of the Vallombrosan nuns. So you can see how much the Desert Fathers' stories have continued right up through very much documented Florentine history at the time of Dante. She is contemporary with Beatrice and Dante and Cavalcanti and so on. And when I discovered her, I just fell in love with her because there were so many parallels to my own story, having fled from my convent after 4 years and so forth and becoming a hermit. So I called my website Umiltà after her. In these saints' legends, you have the need for the body, the relics. And I think we go on to the next slide. Okay, these are, she also had the music compositions. These are manuscripts by her beloved friend who did the hagiography. This is in the Laurentian Library. Next one. I think those panels were actually, sorry, can we go back? No, okay, I've made an awful mess. I'm going to have to try to get back into the meeting. I seem to have lost you. And okay. Right. Next slide. These are my Roma, and this is the story of Santa Parasceva of Iași. She is 14th century. She's a very beautiful young girl who dies at about 12. She stole her parents' food to give to the poor. She was a shepherdess. And the Roma, the gypsies, go to Iași on pilgrimage when her glass coffin is brought out and touch it, and pieces of cotton wool, and they believe that they will be healed for the whole year. And if they can't afford to go to Iași, they come to my office right here and touch my computer screen as they see her coffin being brought out. I love her story, and I love the way they really believe that she will heal them. This is today. And right, the next slide. if we can write. I was interested with these two paintings, Cardinal Bessarion with the reliquary. It's painted by Bellini, but the reliquary is 13th century with pieces of the true cross, which would be considered to be thaumaturgical. This is the word meaning that it's capable of miracles and healing. And then we've just had the Botticelli being sold at Sotheby's with the icon reliquary of an aged saint, which is not Renaissance, it's 1350. Next slide. I gave a relic of St. Cuthbert to Monte Amiata, where the Codex Amiatinus was kept in this cupboard, and it's now used for all of the reliquaries, because I felt it was important that something Anglo-Saxon, or it was rather Northumbrian, got back into that cupboard after the Napoleon had the Codex Amiatinus removed and placed in the Laurentian Library. And they gave me this lovely icon of Christ's face. So there's something about relics that continues to this day. I was actually my spiritual director wanted me to be a Lady of Justice of the Knights of Malta. And it was a rather clandestine order in Tennessee, and I went to visit them. And the Grand Master of that part of the Knights of Malta, I consider him quite bogus, but he collected all of these reliquaries. And there was this absolutely wonderful cross with all of the pieces of all of the women saints named in the canon of the Mass, St. Perpetua, St. Felicity, and so forth. And I would have loved it if he had given me that relic. I don't know what's happened to it now. He's died. But this sense of these lives, which do all come into a kind of pattern, like embroidery repeating themselves, where Gregory speaks about vita instead of vitae, is putting on the mind of Christ. Whether you're male or female, it doesn't matter. You're equal, as you are also with the marriage vows. So I've talked too much, and now it's time for a discussion. So shall we all unmute and do the gallery vista? And let's see. Right. And Danuta, you be the master of ceremonies and organize the discussion.
Oh, okay. Let me just reduce the visual clutter. Excuse me. I just get rid of that and get rid of that. We don't need to look at it now. You can
raise your hand if you want to.
Yeah, if you want to say something. I mean, what I really liked about your point, Julia, is the continuity, because the continuity is not a continuity that has anything to do with umiltà, being in contact with Monegundis, but that they're life parallels, and they're also that sense in which that sort of life, they have a kind of genetics similarity that goes back to the common source. And it works very well with her, even though she's much later and not in contact with Monegundis in any way. And I like you gave me a nice thing to think more about, which is the question, the permission of the husband for letting the wife go.
That's a wonderful essay by Elizabeth Makowski that I find very useful for the Wife of Bath and medieval texts, that the marriage vows were really important and were equitable. If the husband didn't satisfy his wife, she was less to blame than he if she committed adultery and so forth in the court of canon law, which is quite surprising to us, I think, because we still have these sort of chivalric ideas of which are male chauvinist. But there was something very you could be excused from the distaste of fulfilling the marriage vow if your spouse was a leper and so forth. But this was all worked out in canon law about how to deal in a marriage.
But
Yes.
Yeah, Alex?
Oh, just first of all, wonderful, wonderful presentation. Absolutely wonderful for all three of you. So I just want a PS about husbands. So I think of the way saints are so radical in transforming not just spiritual life, but domestic life. And I think of Francesca Romana and Catherine of Genoa, both of whom started hospitals. One, Francesca Romana, in their palazzo, saying to her husband, I hope you don't mind that we're taking a quarter of the palazzo and I'm turning this into a hospital for the poor. And Catherine of Genoa, who had a miserable marriage, but finally, by starting that hospital in Genoa, which is one of the great plague hospitals, transform the marriage. This is getting way ahead, but one of the questions I have has been something I've been thinking out recently, which is you're dealing with early medieval, so this is early modern. This is thinking about Counter-Reformation, the time of Council of Trent really clamping down on not just the number of saints, but the sort of stringency about who and how somebody becomes a saint. And thinking about this crazy parallelism where things are being clamped down on at the same time, you have these kind of promotional campaigns for saints. And I think of somebody like Maria Maddalena de Pazzi, who had this enormous campaign by others with and all the kind of iconography, the etchings and things. So here is my question. It's a very narrow one. The earliest holy card is in about 1403 in Germany. In the 1500s, for the poor, some of the holy cards started to perpetuate. And do you know anything more about that? Because obviously some of these were taken from engravings, but for really poor people, because it used to be that only a nun or a priest could give you one.
It's not a question I can answer. Can either of the Julias help with that, or Maris or Miram maybe?
Because it's a contact relic in the 10th degree.
Yes, Julia, do you know about
I don't know anything about holy cards, not my period. And there were tokens. You get tokens quite early on, and you get ampullae, for example, made out of quite cheap metal, which will just contain a drop or so of water which has touched the saint's shrine. There are a lot of packet ones, obviously. But I'm not good on the late.
yes, I think also even in the very early times in the catacombs and so forth, there would be the vials of oil, or you could touch a rag, which is what my Roma do with the cotton wool on the glass coffin. And I wanted to mention all of those wonderful miracle scenes in stained glass around the tomb of Thomas Becket, and the miracles of healing that happened there, where you had to bring candles the length of your body and so forth for the healing. There was a sense, it's sort of golden bower magic stuff. You had to sort of do sympathy. I mean, I don't get it any longer, but I used to get black mass stuff going on in the cemetery, and it would be putting a photograph of somebody by a tomb if you wanted that person to die. That's not Christian. But there is that sense of magic. I can remember going past Lourdes and seeing these rags tied to the trees by the river. That is the kind of thinking. It's primitive folk thought, but with probably a far greater faith than we educated people have. And I think it's important to give it value instead of disparage it. It's what created the cathedrals. I'm not making much sense, but even the relic of St. Cuthbert came to me by way of an Orthodox hermit who was actually Irish in Ohio, and he had visited Durham, and an Anglican had actually given to this group of Orthodox monks a tiny sliver of the tomb for the radiocarbon dating, the wooden coffin, and a tiny sliver of bone that they had used for radiocarbon dating. And they had carefully divided it up into little pieces of wax with gold leaf, and one of those pieces was given to me when I was a hermit. And that's why I felt I should give it to Monte Amiata. But I think this is the kind of, the fascination of relics. But of course, when you go to the Holy Land, there isn't a relic of Christ. Well, there's Christ's blood and so on and so forth. But you go, there's a hole where the cross was, and you kiss it. There's a hole where the baby was in Bethlehem, and you kiss it. There's the footprints left in the stone for the which is now a Muslim church, a Muslim edifice for the Ascension, and so on. So, in a sense, the saints go in for physical bodies, which lead you to their Christ-like lives. But in a sense, it's also absence as well as presence. I don't know if it's making sense, but I think we do need to go into these rather aspects which we wouldn't accept. I'm going to turn this down because that's an ambulance.
Oh, we've lost your sound.
Right, that was an ambulance going by. What I was saying is that this kind of thinking, it's more in the realm of anthropologists. It's not what we normally would consider acceptable in lecture halls in the academy. We would tend to disparage it. And I think it actually deserves to be valued. It's a very human form of, I can't put it into words, sorry.
Julia, I was thinking, can you hear me? This is Sue.
Yes.
Being that you were talking about not disparaging the basic instincts of people towards their belief and how strong it was in comparison to how we are today, we're much more secular thinking. I was just thinking about, the ambulance went by, I'm thinking COVID, I'm thinking the plague, and during, in Florence at the time, being so many people dying and the need for care. And these women stepped up, and I just found it very fascinating today to think of. But I think that the faith was so basic to survival, and it wasn't like there were, these hospitals where people could go and be away. People were just right there, just dead. And it just really kind of, I don't know if that's what you were thinking about, how basic to survival the faith really was. It wasn't ethereal, lofty, anything for the common folk. From a common folk, I'm going to just put it out there.
Well, I think also what was happening in Florence was with the oblati, the women who were caring for the sick, they were actually much more advanced than the men. They were insisting on hygiene, on cleanliness at Santa Maria Nuova Hospital, which the men didn't realize that this was so important in surgery until very recently. The idea of washing your hands wasn't acceptable in the surgical field until quite long ago. Alex, you're the great expert on Florentine holy women.
Actually, if I could just interject quickly, we've had Manu with his hand up for a long time, and then I think Maurus had a hand up. If I could take Manu's hand first.
Oh, thank you. I have a comment and a question. I was quite intrigued by your reading, Danuta, of Relevazione, and it hadn't actually. It hadn't. When I read it, and I hadn't thought of that, the punishment for having seen the saint seemed very peculiar. Whereas now, with this possible meaning, and somewhere I came across an expression, I noticed Gregory uses gratia ventris purgandi or something, and I think he uses purgare and venter more frequently, but somewhere I have come across lighten one's bowels, and I've been trying to remember in the Latin whether it was what the verb was, but that's maybe something to look for. The comment I have is, why does she return? So she basically inhabits two cells. Her first cell is near the family house, and we have no discussion about whether or not the husband's permission was sought, but it must have been implicitly given. It's implicit in the text. But why then does she, I mean, surely one cell is as good as another, and does it matter that the cell in Tours is really where she wants to be rather than the cell in Chartres? One possibility that I can think about is that Chartres is her own home, and like Abraham, she goes out of her own country. The other thing that I thought of was that it allows her to be firmly pegged lower in the hierarchy to Martin. But does anyone have any thoughts as to why? Why does the cell in Tours, what does the cell in Tours have that she wouldn't have had at her first cell in Chartres?
Maurus, you want to try that question? I'll ask you to unmute. Yeah, lower hand.
Well, I think according to Gregory's thinking was that because the approaching, the problem of vainglory, that she was being praised by her relatives. And I kind of wonder if this the suggestion as to why the husband wanted her back with Professor Barrow kind of to decide, was it because perhaps there was a little bit of material gain for the family by her being a healing back home, and that when Gregory speaks of she was glorified through her among her relatives through these signs of holy power, and because she wished to avoid falling into the trap of vainglory, she devoutly went to the Holy Martin's Basilica, so leaving behind her husband and the household. So, I mean, I'd say the one, you're far away from your relatives who are perhaps praising you, and it's a danger to humility, but perhaps also they're gaining a little bit materially from her ascetic life, and she doesn't want that or has a problem with it. And sort of going to tour, we have already a big, huge profile saint. She can sort of...
But why isn't there a risk of vainglory when she works wonders in Tours? And why does the woman come to her, to be cured of her blindness if she's in the city of Saint Martin?
Well, my personal interpretation is that Gregory is helping her with her vainglory by very firmly subordinating her in all sorts of places in the text, and in describing her as somebody who always has to beg for a miracle. Maybe possibly even some of the things that are elements of physical teaching, but that would be the left hand. But I might also say in the right hand that in my interpretation, which may not be right, I'm assuming that it's because she was a threat that she needed, a thumb put on her. In other words, that she was actually something. She wasn't a nobody.
I think she goes to Tours because she wants to expand her sort of spiritual experiences. I mean, she wants to sort of she wants to learn. I think she's sort of seeking a sort of more discipline, and getting away from her family is going to be a big help. And also, being under Martin's shadow is probably quite helpful. She'll be able to sort of develop without being the sort of most prominent person around. As to why she's sought out by people for cures rather than Martin, women often sought out female saints, and that might also help explain the number of children with health problems who get brought to her, I think. And if she's clearly building up a reputation for dealing with boils, cataracts, and fevers. I say, well, no, her own daughters had died of fevers. So she's got sort of, she's got real skills. She's got her own niche, I think.
I also don't know what quantities would have been like. I mean, Julia emphasized the size of the Basilica of St. Martin. Maybe there were people sleeping in the portico. We know about that, but we don't really have numbers. So perhaps if she had her little cell, if it was where at the Saint-Pierre, Le Poilier place, maybe she was taking overflow there, or taking certain sorts of sick people. The text doesn't tell us explicitly. I mean, it would have been nice if she'd had a vision or something, but we don't hear about that.
Well, isn't there something in her appearing to the man in the dream about her not willing to be considered as a, let's see here.
Competition for Martin.
Well, yes, but she also states, but there is something for me involved in this. Let's see. Where Kate Blessed and Prostrate, okay. I consider myself, this is page 283, I consider myself unworthy of equality with the saints. Nevertheless, you will receive the sight of one eye. After this, however, hasten as fast as you can to the blessed feet of Martin. Prostrate yourself in compunction before him, for he will restore the sight of the other eye. Okay, wait. That wasn't quite the text, I guess I was quite thinking of.
Well, I think the point about that is that at that point in the narrative, these miracles are being controlled by the nuns, presumably, who are, keeping an eye on her shrine and are recording. And
Right.
Gregory then gets hold of the information, and we don't know how, but he must have got it from them. We can separate out some of the bits of information, and you do. I mean, for example, there's a nice example in the Epidaurus text where there's real competition with another shrine, and that's where the whole legend of the sorcerer's apprentice comes from. They can't handle it. The saint is away, the god is away.
Yeah.
But you don't want that type of propaganda. You wouldn't want to say, "Oh, our saint can't deal with it," unless it was a hostile competition, where you'd say they failed there, and then they went to Martin because Monaghan couldn't deal with it. But I assume this miracle comes from her collection.
Well, I'll just want to finish my part. Raise my hand with 2 other comments. I think Professor Barrow might have been on to something about her going to tour. Not only was tour the site of St. Martin's Place, but Gregory was a powerful bishop, and if she had interest too in religious life, and it was also a monastic center with a powerful ecclesiastic, sort of a way that one could seek protection. And then also the thing about holy cards, I mean, really, I don't know, earlier, they don't really take off until the invention of the printing press, kind of really cheap mass-produced cards, tokens from shrines, like badges and metal things, but certainly the contact relics go back to the New Testament, even certainly with the apostles and the Acts of the Apostles, in the presence of people would take cloths in the shadows of the apostles and apply them to others. They would be healing. So I'm not sure about specifically images. So sometimes there are images of the saints on these little ampoules going back into the 4th century and the rest. With holy cards, I'm just not quite sure.
Yeah,
Okay,
Catherine, I saw a hand there.
Hi, yes, if I may, it was on the point there of the basilica and Monaghan maybe taking off the excess there. It's quite interesting that actually Gregory never discusses anything to do with like Monaghan's actual cell outside of the life of Monaghan in the rest of the text. So in the histories, for example, he writes quite a bit on what the basilica looked like and the repairs and restorations that he makes to the basilica, including an extension by adding a new baptistry. But he never refers to a cell being occupied by any other saint. It's only the relics that he introduces into it at that complex. So there's an interesting element perhaps there in the silence of the fact that if she's clearly attached herself to the Basilica of St. Martin, but she's not mentioned anywhere else as being attached to that except in her life and in the Glory of the Confessors, that chapter there. Why not mention her role in that?
Well, the reason the French scholars think that she was dead by 573 is because of that silence in the histories. But that, of course, assumes that he would have been compelled to talk about her in the histories. And I'm not so sure about their argument from silence myself. I'm somewhat skeptic because I don't think he's terribly enthusiastic about her. I need to have my Gregoryometer, my enthusiasm thermometer, but I sense something a little bit, that he's holding back. One doesn't know for sure, but and that perhaps he was so eager to add that addition because it was a personal miracle with his archdeacon, or. We have no details about the traffic in miracles, like something happened, phone the bishop. You had to go, you got it in the book, somebody wrote it up. These things are sometimes written in the same style, sometimes in different styles. Long-term ones sometimes change texture. Like they'll have doxologies separating each one or not, depending on who's writing them. But in some of these cases, I mean, he never claims any direct contact. So maybe they're right. Maybe she was dead by 573. But he could still have written her up because he wrote dead saints up. And as you say, he had a point at which he could have done it. So I'm thrown back to my other explanation, which that he wasn't, raving about her. But the actually, Manu, to come back quickly to your point, I've been checking all the vocabulary. I mean, the normal word used. There are examples of relevatio used for that weight. That is in part what my argument was based on. But the word that is used most often is secedere, and the secessio and the secessus. So, we have the purgation, we have the going off quietly, separately by oneself. And then with women, it's more euphemistic. I don't think, and, I would have to go look at other saints to see, but I think, maybe there's a little cultural historical paper to be written about the female saint on the loo in hagiography and how this is described in Latin versus, how men's rather straightforward cloacal activities are described.
And I think also there's a bit of a parallel with the story of Coventry, where the wife was pleading with her husband, the noble, cruel lord, to be compassionate to the poor. And he would only do so if she would ride naked on a horse through the streets of Coventry. Her hair was so long that it covered her entire body, so she was not seen visibly as nude. But one person did look out of the window, peeping Tom, and his eyes fell out, which is a bit like the story of Monagund. There's a
very good parallel for that, but it's usually a virgin, as it is in the myth of Agnes, where somebody gets zapped for seeing her when she's been exposed in the brothel. So I think it's some sort of variant. In this case, it's the bathroom rather than the sexual parts in a sexual context, but it's still nudity.
Yeah. Alex, you were going to be saying something. No. Alex has been working on the women saints in Florence, and that's how we met. She showed up in our library. What has been fascinating to me here is St. Martin, because it's the Irish saints who generally dedicate their churches to St. Martin. As the Irish hermits as they come across Europe. And in Lucca, there's this most wonderful sculpture on the Cathedral of Lucca where he is cutting his cloak in half. And right by Dante's house, you have the little church of San Martino with the painting by Ghirlandaio of St. Martin cutting his cloak. So there are links that carry us through. Our next Academia Bessarion is going to be on a different topic quite. It's going to be on the decolonialism, the abolitionists in this Florence's English cemetery, and Frederick Douglass, who visits here, the women who write novels against slavery, and so on. And then the following, that will be on March the 2nd, and then April 5th we will work on the Dante scholars buried here, and that's Robert Davidson, Joseph Garrow, who's half Indian. He translates the Vita Nova for the first time into English. And we will be talking about Frances Trollope, her mother Frances Trollope and Hiram Powers, who do Dante's waxworks in Cincinnati on the American frontier. And we will also talk about Robert Davidson, who writes a splendid history of Florence in the Middle Ages, and Adolfo Musafia. And then two wives, Comparetti's wife, Domenico Comparetti's, and also the wife of a Russian scholar, Kudryashev, who was also a Dante scholar. And we'll continue. Then we wanted to go into cardinals, Cusa, Nicholas Cusa, and Cardinal Bessarion, and Julian of Norwich, and Adam Easton. So, and also where you want to come in with topics and proposal, as Danuta has, we are academicians together. We share this democratically. And I do want to thank you. And I wish Alex had spoken up about her research. She's writing a wonderful book called The Saint's Laundry.
This is something, and it was this question about the printing press. And I think that really what interests me is how the campaigns, the sort of promotional campaigns for saints, and those cards, those earliest cards were only given out after a death of a saint, and sort of to mark feste. But when we think of it, that so many convents, well, at least 5 in Florence, were printing books, lives of saints, and were selecting and changing the narratives. So that interests me greatly. And the other thing too is whether, how in fact, and it's sort of Julia Holloway's point, how the poor were brought into this equation beyond just looking at iconography in a church or whatever.
And this is fascinating, because in the Inquisition records and in the canonization processes, which were the trials for the sainthood, you get the voices of the poor, particularly with St. Birgitta. You get the maid servants, you get the crippled nun, and so on. And you're hearing women's voices in a way that you wouldn't in the established textual community. I appreciate that, the humanity of that.
Right. I think it's getting a bit late, I think, and I want to thank all of you for being patient while we were having our bad experience. It really was not what I needed. I'm a very early riser, and so at 8 in the evening, I'm not ready to deal with obscenities and whatnot. But we've survived. I think, Julia, next time what we should do is you should send out the announcement, but don't send the link and have people write to you for the link. Maybe that would be safer. If we've been bombed once, it may happen again.
Yes.
I mean, I don't know whether it happened because it was my account or whether it was just went to more people this time, or.
Right. No, I'm terribly sorry about it.
No, it's not. It's not anybody's fault. It's just evil. It's the evil eye. I'm working on envy now.
It was the demons that are tormenting St. Anthony in the desert.
Yeah, it
quite literally. Yes.
It was the demons. It was really weird, and they seem to be Spanish demons for some reason. But.
Yes.
Is there a way so that everyone is muted and only the host can unmute? That might be, I mean, that doesn't solve the problem of images, but I think there must be controls for Zoom that don't allow you to unmute yourself.
You know, I'm not sure about that. I know that you can't make people turn on their video, and I'm not sure you can unmute people yourself. I think you have to ask them to unmute. So it kind of leaves that in their power.
But I've been to know. I heard a lecture from the American Philosophical Society, and no one who was there was able to. You couldn't unmute.
Oh, well, maybe they set the whole meeting. That
Yes,
would be,
the meeting was set up so that only the host had the power to unmute, so no one could interrupt.
Right. I guess I could do that, but we wouldn't want that then on at the end. It would be
right. But then you would, if they're going to be that patient, my sense is that they obviously just want to make a ruckus at the beginning.
Mm-hmm, I see. No, I had no idea whether they would have stayed the whole time or come back. But
thank you, Lorenzo, for getting rid of them.
Yes, thank you very much for dealing with it. I was trying to get Willem, but I will consult with Willem, who is my expert in all of this, and I'll try to get us some answers, because next time, Julia, you'll be doing it from your account. So.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you
right.
And so you probably should be ready to try to get a co-host if you can, because if you're talking, you can't be dealing with all this stuff at the same time.
Yes.
So
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah, well, thank you all for your patience.
Very quickly, everybody waiting.
Thank you.
Thanks. See you next month.
Yes.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Verlass.